Hey, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Perhaps you can introduce yourself briefly to the audience.
Yes, of course I can. Look, Sarah Blake is my name, and I am a conflict strategist and mediator. And what that really means is I'm here to help people make good decisions, wise decisions when there's conflict, when there's confusion, and when there's change.
And that is the point of this conversation because I found your profile on LinkedIn and some of your readings writing, sorry, quite interesting. Especially in our
Yeah.
pre-meeting before this episode, you know, perhaps we could go back to sort of your upbringing just to touch on that. And because I think that's obviously the trailhead that's led you into the profession that you find yourself in today.
Yeah, I think my history, my story of where I've come to this space has really shaped who I am and what I do. So I would be very honored to share that. I am a second generation mediator. So here in Australia, there is probably a very small handful of us that are second generation practitioners. My father was a barrister and was involved very early in the days of establishing mediation within the legal profession. So I kind of grew up with the language of discernment, of collective decision making. He was a big social justice advocate. So I remember as a kid, we'd get dragged along to all the community protests for a good cause. And I think that really taught me a lot around the impact we can have on making a change and influencing good outcomes. And then from my mother's side,
Mm,
I'm so grateful they were a family of farmers. And their philosophy was really around how do we support community? And that, I guess, is ingrained into me around this notion of walking with people, of listening to country a little bit differently, of strong women.
mm.
And so I feel like from both sides of my family, I've been really blessed with some pretty unique skills that help me do this work.
And I think that was an interesting thing also in our pre-meet, our pre-episode, is where you were talking about more about community because I think you
Yeah,
bring a very unique background, at least from my experience dealing with
yeah,
professionals in the conflict area, if we can call it that.
yeah.
Maybe could you talk a little more about your work with the indigenous folk in, I think it was Northern Australia?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I got my hands dirty learning mediation in about 28 years ago. So some time ago, and I was very fortunate to learn the job of mediation in a community justice centre. So the learning environment as a practitioner then was you learn in a co-model. So you're practicing and learning with someone and a more experienced person. And it was
Mm,
all about noisy neighbours, barking dogs, all the community disputes that you see. And it was such a good place to learn because we had to navigate high emotions. And
mm.
I think that's really paved the way for me then to have some amazing experiences working with remote Aboriginal communities. And that's something that I fell into. I initially, starry-eyed young uni student, thought that I would be an anthropologist and help within the native title land rights space here in Australia. And so I always had an interest in that and found myself working in the conflict space with communities. And that's had a profound impact on who I am as a person and how I practice this job of conflict.
So was it because of anthropology that drew you to work and learn and be educated, educate yourself within the Aboriginal communities?
Maybe it was a curiosity all along. I feel like life led me on a journey, and I was so busy looking for a vocation in a
Mm,
sense, and not that I knew that word in the early days. I was looking for something. I felt like I had something that I wanted to contribute to. And I was living in the Northern Territory at the time, and in the top end of Australia, we're exposed to so many cultures. It's a melting pot from Southeast Asia to the Aboriginal communities right across the space. And so I was very lucky to be able to, I guess, taste some of what it is to be in a cross-cultural space.
mm.
And then I met my husband who's military, and that exposed me to I guess, the bridge between military and communities and the challenge of working cross-culturally around conflict issues. And then
Mm,
because of the military, we've moved. And so I just found myself falling into jobs where I was bringing some of my Northern Territory experience, my anthropology, working with communities
mm.
into conflict spaces, into organizations outside of the Northern Territory. So it kind of just happened. And I guess it wasn't until it was my mid to late 20s where I
Mm.
really landed on this is who I am. This is what I want to do. This is my calling.
Yeah, because if it's okay with you, I'd like to spend
Yeah.
some time understanding and learning about what you've learned from,
Mm,
these ancient cultures per se, these
yeah.
these these that stretch back in time. Forgive my
Yeah.
ignorance, but I think they go back thousands of years as agriculture. Obviously,
Yeah.
they're very distinct depending on area, but in the
Yeah.
Northern Territories, can you speak to a little of about the peacemaking process
Yeah.
or what practices that you learn from
Yeah.
these cultures?
Look, I was very fortunate to be involved in and participate in the Mawa Rom project back in well, actually, it's 20 years ago this July. And the Mawa Rom project was a gathering of peacemakers, mediators from a Western space, and Yolngu being the word for East Arnhem Land Aboriginal people. So Yolngu elders. They thought, how do we build a bridge between our two cultures? How do we bring us together to deal with this mess, this difficulty, this challenge that is Australia. And they decided and discovered that there was a bridge between Western mediation and what their Maorom ceremony was, which was a ceremony of peacemaking. And back when the program started, there was a group of 20 people from across Australia who were invited to dive into the space of mutual learning. In the mornings, we would learn about Western mediation. And in the afternoons, we would participate in traditional ceremony. And I just want to, I guess, let people know and honour the fact that I'm able to talk about this experience because the Yolngu family have given me permission to share these stories. So, as a non-Indigenous woman, I'm very conscious that I can only speak from my own experiences. I can only speak within a limited authority in this space, but I know this much of Yolngu culture, but what I do know and what
Mm,
I've walked through is probably 10 times more than most other people that haven't had the
mm,
opportunity. The experience was deeply profound. I could talk about it all night. And I think it was so profound because it challenged me to first know me. So, in our Western learning space, we're very busy filling spaces. We're very busy talking about everything we know and the badges we wear and the status we have. And this learning space was really designed for us not to take, but rather to give of ourselves. And so there's a vulnerability in that. And the vulnerability created windows to examine deeply who I am,
mm,
to examine what matters to me, what are my values, what is the conflicts that I experience in myself, what is hard. And because you're also in a remote community, we were camping out for a week with limited showers,
mm,
intense. It was a full-on physical experience, which again makes you more vulnerable. So there's a really different practical learning that occurs. And then in the afternoons, we went through ceremony. So up there, it involves being adopted into family. Um, my Yolngu name is Wadingal Damarangi. I'm from the Dampapunya clan. I am a saltwater girl, and I'm very proud of that. And the naming allows community to place us in their microcosm of world, to
mm,
know how they relate to us and how we relate to them. My name alerts them to what are my responsibilities in community, um, what are the right relationships, who can I talk to and who can I negotiate. So we had to learn all of this, these,
mm,
the the fundamentals of what it means to be in that space. And the ceremonies itself
mm,
were conducted in the evening. You have to paint up, which again is such a ritual. There's a
mm,
ritual to the learning of peacemaking, and you share meals together in silence and you listen, and then you honor the ceremony space, you look after it depending on your levels of graduation, and
Mm.
you finish the night with dancing the ceremonial dances. So again, there's a physicality to processing peacemaking and what it means for us to come together.
Yeah, that's I find that fascinating. When you talk about the vulnerability, kind of
Mm,
opening yourself up, and it's not always about beating your chest and
yeah,
showing all the accolades you've achieved, but you said more of giving of yourself to the community or the
yeah,
people in the ceremony per se.
yeah,
Um, I find that, and then as you said, there was a ritual into coming into that space, and then you
yeah.
said we share meals in silence. So
Mm,
you sit in a collective eating together,
mm,
but
yeah,
can I explore that a little with you?
yeah.
What are the reasons why because breaking bread has always been a way of bridging differences amongst
That's
tribes,
right.
amongst nations, or what have you. We just use that as vernacular in
Yeah,
the Western breaking bread. But
yeah.
in this sense, it's maybe it's not the right way, but eating in silence, what does that represent in within the Aboriginal culture, at least in the Northern Territories?
I will for this ceremony and for this project, I can speak of that.
Yeah,
It,
of
it
course.
was,
Please, please.
yeah, it was when we sat in silence and eating, it was a coming of us together. It was a reminder that we all bleed with one blood. It doesn't matter where we've come from. We are all human. And it was a reminder of our humanity, even with all our pain, even with all our conflict, whatever the baggage is that we're bringing to this space, internal, external, that in
Mm,
this moment we are here together. And then what often would happen is very senior elders would talk to us, that they would tell a story or they would share what was important. So you're also meditating in a way of the words that they were sharing with you. And I found, if we compare that to the Western modes of mediation, for instance,
mm,
where we're filling a lot of space talking, it challenges you to self reflect. It really challenges you to remember this humanity connection that we have in the moment,
mm,
and you're reminded that, hey, we still have to live together. We still have to move forward. We still have to do this relationship. We
mm,
not might not like each other, but we have to find a way to do moving forward together.
mm. So, as you said, the elders would tell a story, and the
Mm.
story that they would tell, was that a vehicle to share experiences, to share lessons learned, whether it reaches in decades or centuries, or if not eons of what they've picked up from? Is that the
Yeah, look,
idea?
it varied. It varied. Sometimes it was metaphor stories. Sometimes it was
Uh,
very specific. Sometimes it was teaching us something that was important. So my guess is that there was some discernment around what is the right thing to be saying right now. And more often than not, I would end up with goosebumps by the end of the night. That these were profound sacred moments, and I could feel, you could feel, in a sense, the magic, the spirit of those moments. I feel so honored to have been gifted those. I participated in this program for nearly 12 years. It was
well,
fundamental to shaping who I am.
yeah, so it wasn't just that 1 week retreat per se.
No.
It was over a decade plus 2 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
look, it was fascinating. It was a 4-year program. So
4 year
you
program.
were at 4-year program, 1 week per year. You were only invited back by the elders if they thought you were, I guess, open and aligned to the type of person they wanted. So there was a real, you don't in the Western world just tick the box and come along. You have to show of yourself.
Mm,
And so I moved and I was amongst the first lot of graduates. And then I throughout this time also took on a role of project management, and logistics and helping with the program development and delivery. So
mm.
it became a massive part of my life.
Yeah, that I that I could imagine. Just back to the sort of the eating in silence, and then the
Yeah.
elders telling stories that are, I guess, were bespoke to whatever particular situation,
Yeah.
whether they metaphors or experience. But you said within that time, there was a lot of time for self-reflection, a sense of
Yeah.
vulnerability. And that would speak to that there was again, forgive my ignorance, but there was an emphasis on listening.
Yeah.
If I may ask you, what did you learn about listening? What did you take from
Yeah.
that week, those 4 years about listening that our listeners could, benefit from?
Oh, I can feel the emotion bubbling up already in that question. I love it. I love it because listening for me was one of my
Mm,
biggest learnings in that experience. Let me tell you a story
please.
about listening. In about the second or third year of the project, when I was multitasking between being a student participant and being a part of the project,
Mm,
um, backstory, my father was actually a part of this project, and I didn't know this when I applied for it at the time. So I stumbled into a shared experience with him, which was fabulous and also very challenging. Um, what ended up happening at some stage was because the project called for vulnerability, some of the participants from a Western space, particularly some of my colleagues that I had looked up to, found it too difficult, found it very confronting.
mm,
And I found myself being the brunt of that, the target in a sense of that vulnerability. That they I was young, here's this young white woman, she's easy to blame. I had little power in the experience. And so I really experienced deep isolation and bullying and really massive challenges, which I wouldn't have expected. And it wasn't because of the cross cultural experience, but rather from my own cultural space, from the people that I'd looked up to.
mm,
And I had allowed their vulnerabilities or their feelings to shape how I was feeling about myself. So I started to fall into maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not doing the right
mm,
job. Maybe I shouldn't be here anymore. And it reached a peak, and I was sitting over a cliff on the campsite looking down on the beach, and it was the ocean out around us. And I had tears
mm,
pouring down my face. And in that moment, remember saying, whether it was prayer or to the spirits of the country, I just said, I can't do this by myself. I can't do this anymore. And I took a big breath. And within seconds, a pod of dolphins swam around the peninsula. And they came in and they spoke, and they were just there in front of me, diving and magic.
mm,
And it was so profound, this moment of learning to listen to country differently. And so, listening, I've
mm,
learnt from this experience, is something so much more than what we're taught in the Western world. And so, I'm learning and have learnt to listen to not just people, but to country. I'm learning to listen to the whisper in the trees, the movements in the clouds. I'm learning to look at the environment around us, to the messages that's teaching me, not just the words that have been said. I've learned to listen to the silence and sit with that silence and allow it to speak what it needs to. I've
mm,
learned to listen with my heart, and I've learned to listen by parking my ego. So I've learnt to the internal work to get me out of the way so I can do it better. It's been
mm,
transformative in the way that I teach mediation, transformative in the way that every workshop I do now, I begin the session by saying, hey, we're going to do this and we're going to listen. We're going to practice our listening, disciplined listening. I want you to listen with your ears, absolutely. But I want you to listen with your eyes. I want you to
mm,
listen with your heart, with your stomach. Listen to what's around you, because when we engage all of our senses, we actually increase the information we can rely on. So we're maximizing information. What I've
I
also learned,
sorry,
you,
please
you go.
continue. please.
I was just going to say, what I've also learned is that we don't all listen the same. So when the Yolngu, who have grown up looking in terms of law and spirits, I think they listen differently. I think they can hear things that I just can't even fathom because of my Western skepticism and
Mm.
my Western upbringing. And so I've also had to learn to recognize that we all listen and see differently.
Yeah, you said listen with all of your senses. I haven't heard that listening described like that before, and that really opens up a lot. Maybe the only space where I've seen it is sort of in the dojo, in the
Yeah.
Taekwondo dojo, sort of that Eastern philosophy that mixes
Yeah.
with obviously the martial arts, where they
Yeah.
say, sense everything around you, just not listen,
Mm.
but use your senses. So forgive me bridging, but coming back to what you said, so just to understand, when you were sitting with the silence,
Yeah.
obviously, again, please forgive my ignorance again, but does that mean you're moving more from the subjective to the objective? You're being more sort of a witness or a bystander, almost like seeing yourself on a screen, or like when you say sitting with the silence, is that allowing sort of if it's an internal conflict, let's say you refer to that,
Yeah.
letting that bubble up and see what comes to the forefront of the mind and to, I guess, not judge it, but kind of just reflect and notice it.
Yeah.
And then I guess there's the external, just listening to the silence of whatever rustling leaves or
Mm.
crashing waves or what have you. Eh, Can you sort of just fill my fill my ignorance with some knowledge here?
No,
Because I'm just trying to understand this space. I find it fascinating.
you're doing it beautifully. It is all of those things. I think that for me, listening has become listening to the internal, listening quietly in silence to what is going on in me.
Mm,
What am I feeling? What am I processing? Recognizing it, naming it, letting it slide through if I need to, or what do I need to
mm,
pay attention to? So there is absolutely that. Because I can't do this work if I'm also not myself, haven't done my own internal work. This
sure.
conflict work is too hard. So,
Mm,
absolutely. But it is also listening in silence to the environment around you. But also, when I'm sitting with perhaps some of the old ladies next to the campfire,
mm,
and we don't necessarily share the same language, but we're sitting there and poking the fire and listening and watching everything happen around us. And yet there's this conversation happening between two of us in a deep way without even words being shared. We were able to communicate and identify what really mattered. And, maybe one or two words passed between us. Maybe some pointing and some laughter, always laughter. A- And yet it's those moments that, in a sense, allowed us to see clearly what actually mattered.
mm. Eh, I find it, I thought I was pretty good at listening, but listening to you, I'm like probably a white belt when it comes to listening, maybe a yellow belt doing this for so long. But that's fascinating. And then listening. And so all of this contributes to sort of the cross-cultural or solving conflict or finding resolution or find some sort of compromise. And considering where the world is at right now with the Middle East, with Sudan, with on the edge of Europe, in Bangladesh, and probably a number of other places that I
Yeah.
don't have time to go into here.
Yeah.
I mean, what have you learned from the deep wisdom and knowledge of the Aboriginal people that we could use on maybe a little more global scale? And then I'd like to get
Mm.
more refined to sort of in the corporate space and such. And
Yeah.
but I'm just curious to kind of pick your mind about that.
I think what stands out for me is a quote that I made in passing just earlier, but by a great man who recently passed away, an elder from a community. And this man was key to this project. So, and I won't share his name for cultural respects, but
Sure.
he made the quote that we all bleed the same color. We are
Mm,
all human, and I think that wherever we are in our conflict spaces, it's when we forget the humanity of the other person that we allow conflict to thrive. And so what I learnt from them was the reminder that we all have a place and a role in keeping our society whole. And that, yes, conflict does happen, but we need structured responses. We need clear processes that allow us to engage safely in those really deep, deep questions of difference. And it's that discipline of remembering the person across the table from us is also human and also just wants to be able to live in safety.
So the indigenous that you work with, and I guess I understand
Mm,
you have limited experience and can't speak
yeah.
to everything, but from what you've learned, Sarah, is that the whole idea of ritual, and whether it's the painting, whether it's sitting
Mm,
in silence, whereas
yeah.
listening and reflecting on the story, is that all part of um the process of being
Yeah.
able to share humanity, to sort of drop the ego, to drop our beliefs, to
That's right.
drop our okay.
Yeah. I think what I've learned from that experience
Mm,
is that of how important it is, particularly for us as mediators or conflict resolvers, to be able to provide a structured, ritualed way of dealing with difficult. Because in the heat of the emotion, of the pain, of all of those messy things that drive
mm,
conflict, we're not able to hold space well. It's the responsibility of us as mediators and peacemakers to provide the structure that calms the chaos.
mm.
And so for the communities, it's the preparation, the ritual of preparing yourself to engage in ceremony,
Mm,
the honoring of law in ceremony, the dancing as part of it releases your body to participate in movement, to think, to be really present and get grounded in the
mm,
moment. And I think so many of us are missing that. What are the structures that we use to resolve these hard things? We pull out guns, we fight, we bring violence to the
mm.
table. We're lacking the ritual and the structure that gives us confidence to hold space safely.
And that I really like that term, the whole space, and what that elders had said. We all bleed the same. We do forget humanity. Sometimes
Yeah,
we can you can see it sort of in certain American politics right now, at
yeah,
least on one particular individual, how
yeah,
that politician, how he degrades and demeans someone, or
yeah,
not someone, but a culture or race or whatever it may be, right? And
yeah,
how obviously that when we don't see the humanity in someone, we've heard this time and time again, how we can go to
yeah,
war, how we go to fight and conflict, what have you.
yeah.
So how do we hold space? I mean, obviously, the Aboriginals have a deep and vibrant ritual and ceremony around that. But in Western cultures, we tend to be a little more, well, not a little more, impatient. We just want to get to the solution. We want to rectify the situation or mitigate the
Yes.
problem, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In a Western setting, how can we hold space? I don't know. You said in a structured and a ritual sort of
Mm,
response way. But
yeah.
could you maybe operationally define that or elaborate on that?
Yeah. Look, certainly as a mediator here in Australia, we've got national mediation. Well, actually, it's now called Australian Mediation and Dispute Resolution Standards. They've just brought in new standards, and so that creates some structure if you're doing mediation. The tick boxes, in a sense, of what it
Mm,
means to conduct this process.
okay.
What it means for me, how do I hold space
Mm,
for me in the work that I do? It will really vary, but it begins with a connection of our humanity. It begins with creating a moment where we can create some trust, where I establish my role and their roles, and I establish how we're going to progress this conversation or this intervention. I'm really conscious of making clear, I often work in stages for the work that I do so
okay.
that people can see, yes, we want to get to that solution really quickly. We want a quick fix, but hey, we just need to slow it down a little bit because
Mm,
these are some of the things we need to do. And if we do that, we're going to reduce risk and maximize the chances for a good outcome. I've found that the language that I use, particularly in a corporate space of risk management, of maximizing capacity, of creating sustainable outcomes, all those words that mean a lot in the corporate space, if I can place and house them in my processes, it gives more confidence. So we provide structure by letting them know what comes next. We also get on the front foot. I've recently done a job, and the lady that participated through probably about 3 months of intensive work came to me and said, "Look, I was really frustrated at the beginning because I just wanted to get on with it. But if I hadn't done that work with you, I
Mhm.
wouldn't have been ready to hear this. And we've got a much better outcome." So our job to create and hold space is know when to move forward and when to pause and when to dig down deeper and when
Mm.
to alert them to what will be the challenges. I'm very open and transparent. Hey, this will feel a bit
Mm.
unfamiliar and uncomfortable because you want to rush through. But guess what? We're doing this because I want you to feel like you've processed and understood the issue and are ready to engage in negotiation.
I really like that process, the issue, because, a lot of what I do, I used to work in the clinical space.
Mm,
Now, majority of it is in the corporate space, nothing clinical
yeah,
anymore. And it's just that it's helping people to process emotions. Now, I'm
yeah,
far from a negotiation expert or mediation. I don't even claim to be there. But a lot
yeah,
of sometimes the coaching that I do is that someone's going to go into a tough situation. They're going
yeah,
into a tough conflict or conversation
yeah.
or what have you. And when it comes to that, it's not so much me working with them to resolve the problem with the other person on the other side of
Yeah.
the table, but it's that first conflict, that internal conflict. And what I
Yes.
like what you said, to create whole space, to create that sense of trust or confidence in the process, is that you create a sense of certainty. You walk them through how this is going to do, because from a clinical perspective or cognitive perspective,
Mm.
uncertainty can be one of our worst enemies. And by having
Yeah.
someone experienced such as you in conflict or mediation, by
Mm.
mapping out the territory, people can understand the ecosystem in which they're
Yeah.
migrating. And that creates a sense of calmness. I mean, right down
Yeah.
the physiological, the autonomic nervous system is like they still, obviously there's tension, right? There's always a
Yeah.
butterfly in the stomach going into this.
Yeah.
But it's minimizing, I guess. Is that what I understand?
Absolutely. Exactly. That's exactly right. I do a
Mm.
lot of conflict mapping. We do, we brain dump what they're going through and
Mhm.
help them really identify what are those next steps. And I do think that it helps them. They're already feeling uncertain, right? If you're in conflict, if
Sure.
you're planning
Mm.
for a difficult conversation, your emotions are right up there. So I don't want to add to the pressure by taking them through some really unknown, unfamiliar process. The more I can create meaning to the process, the more powerful it will be. And that's particularly true if we're working in a cross cultural setting, even if we're working between, say, in a corporate sector and negotiating with communities or
Mhm.
whatever the space is. The process has to have meaning for everybody participating. So there is a big element of design in the work that I do, of customization. Because if
Mhm.
I come and try to say, hey, this is how we're going to do it, I'm forcing my will onto them. I'm holding my power in a way that disempowers them from the journey. So I need to make sure that I can design a process that holds legitimacy and that if they reach a decision at the end, that decision will be more likely to be sustainable because, hey, the experience was also legitimate.
It's fascinating. So many questions. So coming back to that, sort of holding the space and listening, when you have two
Mm,
parties that just, they just completely dislike each other, but they need to move
yeah,
on, as you said, we don't have
yeah,
to be best of friends, but we need to find some sort of resolution.
yeah,
How do you encourage um, listening? I mean, can we get a little nuts and bolts here? Because there's a
yeah,
lot of corporate people, a lot of professional people are listening to this, and they're thinking, okay, this sounds great, but how does she
yeah.
do it?
Yeah, what does it mean for me in the workplace, right? Look, one of the interesting things I've found is that, particularly in a workplace, when there's power dynamics that aren't going to change, we've got productivity outcomes we have to get on with.
Mm.
I can't get rid of this person. We just have to find a way to deal with it. Is that I begin the process by doing a one-on-one with the parties involved, whether it's two people for a team of people. And the reason why I do a one-on-one
Mm.
pre-mediation or one-on-one onboarding session is that it is often the first time that parties have been given an opportunity to talk about their experience. I want them to tell me what's going on, why are we here?
Mm,
And I allow them without judgment on my part. It's just I'm holding a vessel for them to tell me what's going on for them.
mm,
And I do that on a one-on-one basis because if I did that in a joint session in a workplace, I don't think it's particularly helpful because what it often does is re-triggers the conflict itself.
mm,
And they're not ever going to get on, like, so we have to allow them to air it. And then we switch gears with the conversation. This often happens in a follow-up session around, okay, so what do we need to do to enable you two to work well together? How do
mm,
we do a bit of capacity development work there around, hey, I know you'd love that rainbows and fairy tales perfect outcome. I know you'd love to get rid of that person, but that's just not possible, right? So what are we working with?
mm,
What does your boss need from you? What do your colleagues need? Where's the organization at? There's a whole pile of reality testing that we're getting them ready to have a very different
mm,
future focused conversation. So the language I start building in then is around, I know we can't change what happens, but what we can do is have some control and influence around what happens next.
mm,
What's that future focus? What are we bringing to that? And then we can engage in a really different type of negotiation that becomes, all right, we don't like each other, but if we do X, Y, and Z, and we commit to that, then chances are we'll at least be able to get on. And that agreement often goes to HR or the line manager
mm,
because it becomes a tool to check in. Hey, how are we going? Are we doing things well? Or have we got a bit of a red flag going on here and we need to come back and check on these things? So the agreement
mm.
becomes a live document that helps them navigate those tricky moments.
So rewinding back, so you have a one-to-one with the various parties in private, whether it's one or four or a team, whatever.
Yep.
And in that sense, they have a chance to maybe become more vulnerable because obviously you
Yeah.
can set the atmosphere to hold space to make them
Yeah.
feel they're in a safe space or arena in which to express their needs,
Yeah.
their wants, their wishes. And so they truly feel listened. And that's part of the mapping
Mhm.
process because
That's right.
and then once you've had part of that, but is part of the one-to-one to try to get them to kill their darlings, to forget, to stop fixating on that one perfect outcome, as you said, and to say, look, we are going to get to an outcome, but it may be a slight permutation or a different permutation than what you actually
Yeah.
thought.
It is. I try to hold off on that reality testing if I can in the session, because if I
Okay.
jump into that, it will shut down their capacity to be vulnerable. So we really just begin often with that. And then
Okay.
I kind of lead into this story around that reality testing. And, it sounds really funny, but I do often find myself saying, hey, I'm not in the business of fairy tales and rainbows. And it's very unusual, unlikely to ever get a perfect outcome. And I think as a practitioner, I try to avoid that notion of win-win. It's more along the lines of what can we live with from this? What can we live with today? What can you live with moving forward? And that language is a little bit softer
Mm,
and it just starts to shift some of that lens from blame, from victimhood
mm,
into, all right, I've been heard. I've told my story. She's listened to me,
mm,
but she's probably right. There is some limitations around what is possible. So, okay, let's get on with that job. So we're kind of separating the tasks from tell me how you are, the narrative, from the action of problem solving.
Again, I find this fascinating. So that would, for me to understand that people can resolve issues, would require a sense of a mature mindset. Now, I don't speak of age. This could be a 15-year-old or
Mm,
a
yeah,
85-year-old, but there's a sense of a maturity of mindset, the ability to see the humanity and understand other people,
mm,
to understand their vulnerabilities, to understand their own vulnerabilities, to find that there is going to be some sort of permutation of an outcome at the end of the
yeah,
road, but it may not be the perfect one that I had
yeah,
hitched my ride to per se.
yeah,
And so that kind of brings me as a Canadian, I only can speak to the Canadian. Like in Canada, it's right now in the culture, it's almost like what not to do for other nations because there's
yeah,
so much sensitivity. It's so much black and not black and white as in race, but black and white, seeing
mm,
issues as black and white, not the nuances of
yeah.
gray.
That's right.
and the polarization and the oversensitivity. I mean, as a
Yeah.
professional working in the space that you do, I mean, how do you deal with
Ugh,
individuals who are so, you just say the slightest thing, they
yeah.
break down, you have to walk on eggshells and such. Because I know a lot of clients that I coach, they speak to this every week. There's some
Yeah.
sort of character on their team or department like that, or if
Yeah.
not many,
It,
to some degree.
It is exhausting. It's exhausting for people to have to deal
Mm,
with the polarizing and the lack of capacity to engage in nuance. And I see it again and again. I think for me, it's the capacity to dig down into what's driving this
mm,
that then helps me. What is the best way I can help this situation? And sometimes it's a matter of going back to the line manager or the
mm,
CEO or whoever's engaged and having a really realistic talk around, hey,
mm,
I don't think this problem can be fixed. I think you're going to have to change gears. And so I'm not going to waste people's time by holding them in a mediation if I don't think it's
mm,
useful. And I'm pretty upfront with parties as well. Part of my onboarding is, are you here to engage in problem solving? Are you really up for the task?
mm,
Is there good faith in this process? Sometimes and increasingly issues of mental health, the blame and the victimhood mentality are
mm,
so ripe and so strong that there's not a lot of room for movement. And I think as practitioners, part of our role is to recognize we can't fix everything,
mm,
and that sometimes there's only so much we can do when we have to draw the line in the sand and say, hey, enough. We're going to have to take that harder response now. We're going to have to elevate the way we deal with this because we're not getting any movement with this strategy. We're going to have to change gears. And I think that's okay because not everyone is ready for the task of problem solving, of
mm,
collaboration. Some people, I was reminded in a job I recently did
mm,
by a dear colleague who reminded me that sometimes our idea of a good outcome is not what others' idea of a good outcome is. And I knew this, but I just forgot it because this team had come so far and they'd shifted, and done amazing work. But I could see these little, I guess, alerts that they still had so far to go. Why hadn't they got there yet? And she reminded me that sometimes we've pushed them or journeyed with them as far as they're able to go, and to allow them dignity in that space, and that's okay, but it
mm,
just doesn't align to where the organization is.
mm,
So it it changes the tone of a conversation. It changes the tone of how you manage someone
mm,
when you can recognize, hey, we've done the very best we can, but clearly this isn't going to work.
mm.
So perhaps we need to have a different type of a conversation.
I think that's so well said. I mean, I haven't articulated so well as you have, but from my experience, sometimes leaders, managers, team heads, what have you, have to have the courage to understand that not everything can be resolved. That sometimes
Yes.
the best thing is for that person to move on, but
Yep.
sometimes they lacked the courage to do that. And in some regards, I can understand that because in
Yes.
such a sensitive environment, such a brittle and fragile environment that we
Yeah.
find ourselves in right now because of this whole woke
Yeah.
movement, if I may
Yeah.
use that word, is
Yeah.
that people, men, women of whatever race, may feel that they're seen as a racist, a chauvinist, a
Mm.
ist of some
Yeah.
sort, and that in itself is like, okay, I don't want to open
Yeah.
this can of worms because I
Yeah.
don't need the heat. I got enough challenges in my life.
Yeah.
But I mean,
What do
as
you do with that? It's
yeah,
so
exactly.
difficult. Yeah.
Yeah,
Look,
I'm just
I
curious
often,
from your
I,
perspective.
yeah, look, I often say when I'm coaching people through similar situations is it's recognizing we all have responsibilities. So be very clear
Mm,
around what your responsibilities are. Have you
mm,
have you addressed the responsibilities, not just to this individual,
mm,
but to the rest of the team and the organization? And so, look, I can see that this is really difficult for you.
mm,
And I know that you wish we could have a different outcome. And look, I can empathize and I wish we could too, but my responsibilities are this, and there isn't a lot of wriggle room here.
mm,
And so, what it is owning your responsibilities and role, and owning it in a way that isn't driven by fear, but is deeply grounded in a knowledge of. What is right for you and what is
Mm,
right for the regulations, the legislation environment. So when you're aligned with those things and recognize that there are no perfect outcomes,
mm.
it's just what we need to do, that there comes a freedom from that. And I think that we can't change everyone. And you have to be, as a leader, you
Mm.
have to be okay with that.
Yeah, and that's the process. I mean, everyone logically understands that, but the rate in which we move on to have alignment with that logic,
Yeah.
emotionally, it takes time, and a lot of the
Yeah.
times it comes from experiencing. But I
Yeah.
think leaders who hire you not as a mediator, but as a coach, a sparring
Yeah.
partner, that I think that would be part of the process, by
Yeah.
talking to you every second or third week and just sort of working
Absolutely.
through it, right?
Yeah, there is. I think often people in leadership positions don't have the conversations with outsiders or with anyone. In fact, they keep it
Mm,
internalized because they don't want to acknowledge that this is hard and I might not
mm,
have all the answers. So I become a safe space for rigorous conversation. I ask lots of
mm,
questions, and it is questions about knowing who you are as a leader, what your role is in the organization, and what are those things getting in the way. And once we know those things, we can start to strategize. We can start to boost up your toolkit to be able to have those right interventions at the right time.
yeah, and you have so much more patience for individuals than I do. You know, I work with a lot of sort of mature mindsets or people evolving towards that. But some people
Mm,
again, this is not an age thing or a gender
no,
thing at all. It's just a mindset thing, a psychological state of mind. But some people just get so stuck in their, as you called it so eloquently, their victimhood, or they're just looking for everyone else to blame,
yeah,
right? And it's these individuals, for whatever reason, hopefully they evolve at some point. But I think it's finding that courage. And as you said, following the regulations, following the
yeah,
law, following employment, whatever
yeah,
that's stipulated, and then following through with that. Because I
that's right.
think at the end of the day, that manager, that leader, that team head, that project head, they're thinking, oh, I don't want to hurt that person. But what's the rest of the
Yeah,
team thinking, right?
exactly. Yeah. Look, I often see leaders avoiding having performance managing someone, for instance,
Mm,
because it is hard work and it takes more time. And why can't they sort it out themselves? And yet, by not doing that task, they prolong the destruction. They
good way of saying
lead
it.
to toxic culture. They lead to teams' culture becoming really negative. And so,
Mm,
there is a cost for us not doing anything. And I think as practitioners, perhaps we've done a disservice to our role by overemphasizing the positives and not talking about, hey, if you don't do
mm,
these are the costs. The costs are real.
mm,
And adding tangible dollar figures, adding tangible people costs to it. And when you start to risk assess differently,
mm.
it very quickly highlights the real benefits of early intervention.
Yeah, and I think it obviously there's the numbers, but when you talk to someone about his or her reputation,
Yeah,
his or her credibility, right? Their ability to, stand up and hold the line.
yeah,
You know, when you start talking about that, about someone's, reputation, then
yeah,
it's like, okay, okay. Sometimes that's you have
yeah.
to pull that card, right? Because
That's right.
everyone wants to show up with credibility and transparency
Yes.
and to be
Yeah.
trusted, right?
Yep.
But if you
Absolutely.
lack the backbone sometimes, or you're trying to find the backbone to have these hard conversations,
Mm.
it's you better giddy up. I think you better
Yeah.
find that fast. And I think
Yeah.
hiring someone such as you as an external consultant or a coach or a sparring partner, whatever
Mm.
vernacular you want to use, I
Yeah.
think that's an investment. It's not a cost. The dividends are huge,
Yeah.
for a leader to have someone such as yourself, Sarah.
Yeah. Look, I love the coaching work, and it's something that I've
Mm,
probably been doing for about 5+ years now.
mm,
And it's such an honor to do that with somebody. I think to see them journey and see
mm,
them thrive through it is a really profound gift. And so
mm,
I'm very grateful for that. But I think there is this notion of, as leaders, we are called to both hold a hard line with an open heart.
mm,
And I see leaders I'm working with and have observed a number of new CEOs over here recently that their language is of empathy, of working with people and culture, all those right buzzwords. But when, excuse my French, as shit hits the fan, when things get
Yeah.
really difficult, they just crumbled, right? That they
Mm,
aren't able to enact the language that they've been sharing with everyone. And
mm,
what it does make their job of credible leadership so much more difficult. People lose faith
mm,
in them. They lose the confidence that, hey, if something goes bad, that I will be okay.
mm,
And
mm.
so there's a real critical need to make sure you align in your leadership, your words and your actions. And it takes work and we don't always get it right, but our ability to own that and say, hey, yeah, I got
Mm.
that wrong. Let me try that again. That's the elevation of leadership.
It's just that trust, credibility, reputation, that takes brick by brick to build, but it takes
Yeah.
one momentary lapse of reason uh to shatter it, you know.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to having a sparring partner to kick around ideas before you go into, the field of combat or
Yeah.
conflict, or sorry, wrong.
Yes.
But
No,
you
no,
get
well,
what
it
I'm
is
saying.
that too, right?
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
it is, as you said, reality test how you do things. I really like that.
Yeah.
Reality testing things with a sparring partner to play through different scenarios. Again, as a mediator, what you learn from the Indigenous and Aboriginal culture is to create, in a sense, a ritual around things, to create a sense of
Yeah.
certainty, to map the territory in which they're going to move,
Yeah.
and that kind of calms them down, so they have the confidence to
Yeah.
move in. Um, we're coming close to the top of the hour. I was wondering, on a positive note, w-
Yeah.
how do you see the future of leadership and conflict resolution or conflict strategy per se?
It's such an interesting space at the moment, particularly in the conflict space. I am really intrigued. I suspect there's a bit of a rift happening in the conflict space, and a bit of a rift between a multidisciplinary approach to dealing
Mhm.
with conflict and helping people deal with conflict, and then a closed lens which is predominantly driven by a legal frame of reference.
Okay.
And and I worry a little bit that these two worlds are moving apart. And I think that does a disservice to the people experiencing conflict. So, what I'm really excited about is this cross-discipline space. It's a recognition that we live in a complex world and that the business of problem solving and wise decision making is challenging and we
Mm,
can't do it by ourselves. So, the capacity to be able to know your limitations, to draw on wide fields of input, the capacity to apply conflict management, the building the bridges, advocacy work in environment spaces, in governance spaces, all of the ESG work.
mm,
And I
mm.
think that that's a really exciting and transformative work. This is about the long-term viability for us as a world. We won't get into the future if we can't learn to do us together. And I
Mm.
think it's the peacemakers and the mediators and the bridge builders. I think we're the people that have a responsibility to pave the way for that work.
And one last question. Are there any thoughts, ideas, or pieces of wisdom you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
Yes. What I would love to say to the listeners is that it's okay to be in the mess of the moment, that conflict happens, that life isn't always perfect, and that's okay. But it's up to us to find our own hope. And in finding our own hope, we are taking power for creating better solutions. And we do that through the hard conversations, finding that courage, bringing curiosity, and finding calm. I think that we've lost the art of that moment of calm.
Sarah, well said. It's been a blast, this conversation. I learned so much. I have other questions, but I think we're going to have a follow-up conversation at some point. I mean, it's such a unique, a unique perspective you bring to the table here. Talking to the Aboriginals and the Indigenous over a 4-year period, if not 12 years, I think you said, wasn't it?
Yeah.
12 years,
Yeah.
sorry, but it was a 4-year program.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fascinating, fascinating. So I really appreciate you, your generosity of time today and sharing your background with us.
Such an honor. It's such a privilege to share, and I hope it gives other people the courage to find their own voices and to have their own conversations because it's one story at a time we change the world.
One last thing. You have an online course. Sorry, I should have brought
Yeah.
this up earlier. You have an online course. Is this part of what you teach on that online course to
Yeah, it's
potential
very
leaders and
new.
members? Mm,
It's going to be launched very soon, so it's not quite active, but
okay.
it is a bit of it's a new course. It's a taster. It's a taste for people to start to get to know themselves and how they are in conflict and how might I start to have some of those hard conversations. So it's giving people a bit of a taste into the world on how to do this better.
Okay, Sarah. I need you to promise me you'll give me a heads up when that's up and launched, and then I will make sure it's in the show notes. Uh,
I would love to.
Great, great. Thanks again, Sarah. I really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Take care.